that there is a crisis in news coverage in this country right now, born of the dissolution of the traditional mainstream media and the rapid growth of other venues for getting news. Unfortunately, it has led to a great deal of confusion, proliferation of what is often referred to as fake news, and certainly the siloing of news into areas that don't give people the broadest possible look at news and information that would inform them and give them the opportunity to make up their minds independently about issues. Nancy West recently announced at In-Depth NH that the New Hampshire Center for Public Interest Journalism was joining together with other nonprofit organizations into an alliance of nonprofit news organizations, ANNO, I believe it is. And the work that Nancy has done and the work that indepthnh.org has done since its inception has been outstanding. I dare say that the battle over the Northern Pass might have come out differently had it not been for the fact that of all the news sources in the state of New Hampshire, indepthnh.org was there from the beginning right to the end, and I don't think missed a single hearing in the entire process, while many of the other organizations, New Hampshire Public Radio, for example, the Union Leader, Concord Monitor, they were missing in action when it came to what was one of the most important stories for an entire decade in New Hampshire. So we're trying to find our way when it relates to how we're going to present the news to people and how we're going to consume the news as consumers. And In-Depth NH is only one player in that process. But where the rubber meets the road when it comes to providing news for people is with the reporter. And today's guest, Gary Rayno, is one of those people who has been in the reporting business for long enough to have experienced it as a traditional reporter for a mainstream media outlet, several of them, in fact, including Foster's over on the Seacoast and the Union Leader. And now he is a reporter for indepthnh.org. And his skills give him the wherewithal to not only report a story, but to take a deeper dive into the facts. And we're going to look at a very specific area of inquiry today. And to help us out with that, in addition to Gary Rayno, I've asked Michael Kitch, who was the chief economic guru for the New Hampshire Senate for a number of years while I was there. I can remember quite a number of nights and days where we would pore over spreadsheets and other information with Gary Rayno, trying to either convince him of a case that we were trying to make or understand something better. But Gary had a keen eye for uh, numbers and for bullshit. And so we always knew that that we could count on Gary to ask the right questions, to give us insight from his perspective as a journalist. Um, and we also knew that he couldn't be hornswoggled, if you will, to use an old phrase. That he would see through that the minute you tried. And so, what I hoped to do in this podcast was to explore the issue of when public dollars can be considered as public investments and when they're merely spending. You know, there's one group of politicians who consistently make the case that cutting taxes helps to drive the economy. There's another group of political leaders who believe that there are other kinds of investments that have a more vital role and a more useful role in creating growth. Recently, Gary had an article where he examined a report from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute about investments in New Hampshire, specifically what kind of returns we actually got for public dollars that were expended. And I want to just share with you on the screen here the graphic from Gary's article because I think it's incredibly instructive. These were various programs that the state instituted over the last few years, and the economic growth per dollar that was invested that has actually been calculated as return. And I think you can see from if you start right at the very top with the supplemental nutrition assistance, which is what we used to call food stamps. It's the SNAP program. For every dollar that was invested, it returned $1.61 of economic growth. And we'll ask Gary to unpack that in the course of this, and we'll get comments from Michael Kitch on it as well. Supplemental unemployment insurance. For every dollar invested, there was $1.49 of economic growth return. Aid to state and local governments. For every dollar invested, there was $1.34 in returns. Low income home energy assistance. For every dollar, $1.31. And you get down to the tax cuts that so many people rely on as a mechanism for driving growth. And you see that the dividend and capital gains tax rate reduction that took place recently, for every dollar that was expended in the way of tax reductions, only 38 cents were returned to our economy. Likewise, with the corporate tax rate reduction, for every dollar that was expended to reduce corporate rates, only 32 cents were returned to our economy. In the show notes to this podcast, I will make sure to reference this very useful report from the Fiscal Policy Institute of New Hampshire. And it's quite instructive to understand that it appears, and we'll ask them to discuss this, it appears that money invested in important human capital provided a far greater return to our economy than tax cuts. And in fact, tax cuts had a negative rate of return, not a positive rate of return. Does that mean tax cuts are never appropriate? Absolutely not. Does that mean that all public spending is going to generate economic growth? Absolutely not. But it does mean that we need to understand better what kind of impacts investments that we make, whether it's in public education, whether it's in infrastructure, irrespective of where it is, we need to understand the real impacts of those things. And I am pleased to have Gary Rayno and Michael Kitch on this podcast to discuss those and other issues related to state spending. So let's get started. I'm pleased to have Michael Kitch, who is now retired, but still active in terms of staying up with trends and news, and is one of the finest minds that I've ever known. Michael, in addition to his other qualifications, he was educated at the London School of Economics, among other higher education institutions. Gary Rayno is a man that needs no introduction when it comes to journalism in New Hampshire, and what he offers on an ongoing basis is, in my opinion, nothing short of heroic. Well, there we are. It's just like old times. Michael, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can see us now, huddled over some spreadsheet trying to explain our position to Gary, Michael. Well, let me just say that I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with two old friends who understand economics far better than I do, and who I counted on to lead me through the process in the Senate of looking at these kinds of things. Gary Rayno, who knew more than any other reporter there, in my opinion, when it came to understanding the intricacies of the budget and economics. And Michael Kitch, who had the big picture on economics and always was very pleased to be able to educate me. Most of the time doing so without making me feel too embarrassed about it. Gary, you had a piece in In-Depth NH this past week on returns from certain public investments, and it was particularly interesting. And I thought that Michael could add some color to the discussions of that. But if you wouldn't mind setting the table for us, talk about where that study came from and what were the highlights of it.
Well, the study came from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. Phil Selton has done some really good work in that area. And he pulled together all these national studies and everything else. And basically looking at the long time, shall we say, myth that tax cuts lead to spurring the economy, business tax cuts. And he spent a great deal, it's about 20-page study that they did, that really these tax cuts don't spur the economy that much. And certainly not enough to create a lot of jobs, but they certainly do reduce the amount of revenue that's available to the state. And it goes into a lot of detail. Basically, he's saying that the sort of expansion we're seeing now in the revenues are due to other things, economic activity beyond these tax cuts. They really have very little to do with the kind of revenue that we're seeing in the state right now, business tax wise.
Well, what kind of public expenditures did they look at?
Well, they're looking at the growth in things like jobs and and he was looking at versus expenditures, for example, in the SNAP program, where $1 spent in the SNAP program provides like $1.61 in return, whereas a business tax cut provides something like 24 cents on the dollar. So there are other ways to make investments in the state, which can do a lot better job of spurring the economy and creating jobs than tax cuts can, because a lot of the tax cuts, particularly for the business profits tax, which is where all the money is right now, it's going out of state in dividends and higher salaries and all that, and so much of it is not staying here, and it's not going to be spurring the economy here. It's going to be helping people out other places.
Mm-hmm. Michael, as you educated me so many times, members of the business community often talk about their own investments that they make in their businesses as a means to achieve growth and return. Yet oftentimes when those same kinds of or when spending is proposed at the state level, they see it purely as spending. They never really look at it as investment. So maybe you'd be interested in sort of commenting about this study in terms of whether, pardon me, in terms of whether public dollars that are spent should be seen as an investment, and when is it that we make a distinction between whether it's an investment or pure spending?
Oh boy. Let me start by saying that this notion that I think Gary rightly described it as a myth or an illusion, that tax cuts lead to economic growth. and this goes back to the 1970s, to the supply side gang around the Wall Street Journal, and people like Arthur Laffer and Jude Winitsky and George Gilder and a whole bunch of other amateur economists, but vivid ideologues have been pushing this notion for years that tax cuts drive growth. And what we know is that the prime drivers of growth are investment and consumption. And that investment includes public investment. And as Gary says, as a dollar invested in human services, for example, a whole range of human services, from food stamps to childcare, you name it, produces a positive return. And at the same time, investment in public infrastructure, whether it's highways or school building aid, for example, that also produces a positive return. And I mean, school building aid, for example, is about a third of the business of major construction companies in New Hampshire. When the moratorium was in place, the construction companies were pretty upset because it diminished the amount of work they could do. And the same with highways and roads and bridges. So that's kind of the background, and what Phil Sletton showed was that we've cut the two business taxes since 2015. We've cut the BPT from 8.5% to 7.5%, which is about an 11% cut in the rate. And we've cut the BET even more, from 0.75 to 0.56, which is about 27%. And as a result, we've foregone, as Phil Sletton estimates, something like, I think the estimates, Gary, if I'm right, are 496 on the low side and 729 on the high side of revenue over those years when the taxes were cut.
Was that 700? Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Was that in millions of dollars? 700, 729 million. Okay.
Yeah, millions. And this is a state that just stop and think. The housing problem, the school funding, the YDC settlement. We have some pretty big commitments out there. And by cutting those taxes, we basically left a lot of revenue on the table and got no significant economic growth.
Right. So we've given up that income, those revenues that would have come into the general fund or other funds within the state of New Hampshire, and gotten almost nothing for that.
Yeah, in terms of job growth, new businesses. It was said that by some that if we cut taxes, more businesses will move to New Hampshire. There's no indication of that. I think Phil had some numbers. Well, for example, the number of tax filers increased 16%, but tax revenues grew 48%.
Tax
And
revenue.
the number of work sites grew 18%, revenues grew 87%. Because revenues did increase during this period. They just didn't increase to the extent they would have had the taxes not been cut.
Uh-huh. Gary, can you just let's take the SNAP program as an example. It's sort of easy to describe it in the broadest possible terms, but let's put the I guess the fodder on the fence, if you will, and explain what it is that's happening. Why is there economic activity as a result of the SNAP program?
Well, it's a food program that helps people who are on the low end of the income spectrum. And and the whole, I think, a large takeaway from this whole study that he did was these programs that help the low to the middle income people who actually need the money, put the money into the economy. They're going to go out and they're going to buy food locally. They're going to do things locally. They're going to buy more things at the local level. And that's where you're getting a direct impact from the money that the state is putting out there into these programs. Whereas when you start cutting taxes, business taxes, you don't know where that money's going, and a lot of it isn't going locally. So you're having a much more of a direct impact on these programs. The same thing with the they have the farmers market that you can go out and buy food there too with the SNAP stuff and things like that. And it's a direct impact into the local economy. So you are seeing where that can make a big difference. And if this kind of money that we're talking about losing, if you put that into that kind of local economy more than you are into paying off dividends and so on, you're going to see a much bigger impact in job growth and economic activity.
Right. So I was at the local farm, one of the local farm stands in Plymouth a couple of days ago, and noticed that they accepted SNAP payments there. So they would be people would be using that to buy food at the farm stand or at the grocery store.
Yeah. I mean, and people are using some of this money to pay rent, and they're using it to buy supplies for other things as well. You know, you gotta have to fix your house up every once in a while and things like that.
Yeah.
It's much more directed economic activity that you can see on the local level than the business tax cuts are.
There's I think a lot of well, let me just make one comment about all those old timers that Michael was talking about. I noticed recently that David Stockman has had a change of heart and is spending a good deal of time apologizing for trickle down economics. Have you seen that, Michael?
Yeah, I did notice that. If I could just add, the way to look at this is what does cause economic growth, and primarily it's two things: it's investment and it's consumption. And consumption is what Gary just described. It's people spending money. And firms thriving because they have a strong market. an investment, whether private or public, is what's required to produce the goods that are consumed. And those two things are what make economies grow. Not disinvestment in tax cuts, which is essentially a form of disinvestment. That's one of the conclusions I drew from Phil's report. That imagine if $500 million had been put in the Affordable Housing Fund. Here we are saying that we have to build 90,000 housing units by 2040. Well, that's not going to happen without some public investment.
So why is it then that except with the rare exception, I remember a couple of years ago there was one of the billionaires who was warning people that that if they didn't start dealing with this savage disparity of income that existed in the country, that the pitchforks were going to come out. Why is it that more of the business community isn't echoing what that person said in his op-ed?
That's a good question.
It's befuddling, isn't it? I mean, if you don't have consumers that are making purchases because they just can't afford it, then the business community is gonna suffer from that.
Yeah, I think so. I think I don't want to get into the whole wokeness issue, but a part of that is business is an approach to business that considers the community as one of its constituencies, and how you let me go back. Milton Friedman, some time ago, and Harvard Business School put out the notion that the only job of a company was to make a profit for its shareholders, period. And in effect, that's kind of what's happening. I just finished a book on the recent history of the Federal Reserve, and one of the points that the author makes is that the Federal Reserve has pumped so much money into the economy, and so many companies have used that money to borrow, to buy other companies, strip them down, sell them, load them up with debt, and then sell them or merge them or what have you. The whole economy has become essentially financial manipulation rather than production. And companies large companies in particular, have focused purely on that, whereas it's the small businesses that are innovating and producing new products primarily.
Well, Gary, what Michael's describing sounds like a house of cards. I mean, is there any sense, whether it's on the state level or the federal level, that among political leaders and bureaucrats that they understand this is going on?
Well, I think that's what's going on now in Washington. Is I think that uh, the Biden administration is saying, hey, we've done this your way for so long. You know, there's a trickle down economics. We know it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. So now we're going to try the investment. We're going to try to get the manufacturing going again. We're trying to get people back here to make products. We learned from the pandemic, we can't have everything offshore anymore. We have to start doing things with ourselves again. And with that, I think he's saying we're also probably going to be raising wages. We're going to, you know, bring the whole float. You know, the good economy floats all the ships. And I think seeing that, I mean, we're also seeing the other side of that there, particularly in the House Republican, where they don't want to deal with that sort of thing. It's, you know, it's the idea of cutting the interest and dividends tax in New Hampshire and eliminating it, so you can say we really don't have any income taxes in New Hampshire. I mean, and that's why you're doing it. It's not because, I mean, what you're doing is cutting off the only tax in the state of New Hampshire that actually taxes wealth, and you know, it doesn't make any sense. So I think, yeah,
you got 50 years of just a growing disparity of wealth in this country, or quite nearly 50 years. And it almost seems like the approach of the Biden administration is to sort of tinker around the edges as well. I mean, it's not like anybody is really stepping up to the plate and saying, okay, here are some real and significant ways to increase the asset wealth of low income and middle income Americans. Am I wrong?
No, I think you've got a point. I think the administration can only do so much, and state governments can do even less. I think particularly in a small state like New Hampshire, New Hampshire's economy is very liable to what goes on in the national economy. It's too small a piece of the pie to really affect dramatic change. It can do certain things, but it's always to some extent going to be driven by national trends, just as the revenue was driven by the enormous surge in corporate profits that was not peculiar to New Hampshire or peculiar to New England. It was nationwide. But I think and I don't want to get into the weeds, but I think it's primarily the national problem. On the one hand, you have the Biden administration making enormous public investments, primarily the ARPA program, the COVID relief programs on the one hand, followed by the infrastructure investment on the other, and enormous public investments. On the other hand, you've got the Federal Reserve pumping money into the economy, which they've been doing, frankly, since the Great Recession, 2008, with the so-called quantitative easing. And one of the major effects of that has been to increase the value of assets, and particularly financial assets, which are owned by the wealthiest people. I'm talking now the stock market in particular. But a lot of that money that was pumped into the economy to get out of the recession and continued to be pumped into the economy well after, went to the top of the income scale. And how you deal with that, I don't know. Because obviously that's just one part of managing the national economy.
Well, you mentioned Milton Friedman before, but and certainly there are some things that you can be critical of Milton Friedman for, but he also came out in favor of universal basic income. And but it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of movement in that direction. I think there's a lot of experimenting going on, but what do you guys think about that notion?
I mean, what we're really talking about is sort of like a return to what happened in the 50s and 60s, where the middle class was able to buy houses and buy refrigerators and buy cars every 3 years and so on. But we're so far from that right now that, all the money is at the top of the scale, and there are only so many yachts you can buy and so many homes you can buy on millions of dollars. And the money, I mean, it's the whole problem with the trickle down issue. And I mean, it's going to take a significant change in the way that this country does business if we're going to go back to having the kind of economy that provided a really solid middle class that was capable of driving innovation like we have never seen before.
Right.
And
So when you say there are only so many cars and boats and houses you can buy, that's when only the wealthiest 1% or 10% are actually able to afford to buy them to begin with. But if the general population, as you say, if the middle class and the working class in this country were in a position because they had greater asset value, then there would be a whole lot more economic activity, a whole lot more houses and cars and all that purchased. And you're not optimistic that we can figure out a way to get back to that. But let me just ask you, I'm probably stepping way out of bounds on this because it's an idea that I've been toying with. But why is it that we can't figure out ways for Americans to be involved in the asset growth that takes place within our economy? Norway has, and Finland and other countries have these sovereign wealth funds that are being generated from the revenues of their strongest industries, and they're being distributed to the people of those countries. Why is it that we can't get consensus on that kind of thing within the United States, given the fact that they don't necessarily require onerous taxes, or and there are some people who say they don't require any taxes?
We're really talking about, Wayne, is political will. I mean, there doesn't seem to be the political will to do those sort of things here. I mean, and the other side of it, I think, is, the Citizens United decision by the court is probably one of the worst things that's ever happened to this country. I mean, it just opened the floodgates to money in politics, and there's so much money there flowing in, and it's coming from the top of the heap. It's not coming from down below. And those people are going to be beholden to that money. If you want to win, you're going to be beholden to it. And they have no incentive to change the situation the way it is anymore.
will there be a point though when it's when they have so starved the middle class and the working class families and the precariat, if you will, of the country, that that even they will turn around, and will it be too late?
I'm more pessimistic. I think a political contribution to pretty much any candidate is a form of disinvestment. I don't see where it's. I don't see. I guess I'm very pessimistic for a number of reasons. Not least the fact that we have 50 states which can't agree about much of anything. They all see themselves as, quote, sovereign, unquote, and have their own character and their own values and so on. So it's pretty hard to, every national program has to be tailored to the idiosyncrasies of whatever state decides to get up on its back legs and scream it about it. That's one problem. The other is that the politicians know who votes and who doesn't. And they don't pay a lot of attention to the people who don't vote, who often are the people that need the representation the most. I don't know where this goes. I really don't. I have no idea. But the financial issues, I think at the very least require a significant overhaul of the federal tax system, starting with the top and going back to a time when the top marginal rates were pretty punitive.
Oh.
I don't think you can redistribute income through goodwill. You have to take it away from them.
Well, there are, I don't know if you happened to listen to the discussion that I had with Mark Blythe, who wrote a book called Angrynomics, he and Eric Lonergan. And they made the case that if you simply took the 2 or 3 major economic crises that we had in this country and redirected a percentage of the monies that were spent to bail out the topmost financial section of the ladder, and redirected that toward shares of stock that belong to the American people as a right of their citizenship, that we would have billions of dollars at our disposal for positive public purposes without taxation or additional taxation.
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, I encourage you to read a book.
Most of the money in the bailouts went to rescue the banks.
Right. Understood.
So if you don't rescue the banks, then you have another problem that you have to solve at the same time.
It's one thing to rescue the banks. It's another thing to say that we're gonna give you the money to rescue you, and you don't have to pay any of it back to us. Or there's no public debt that accrues as a result of that is shared.
Right.
See what I'm saying? the result of what we've been going through has been that there's this growing level of anger, and clearly that a lot of that is partisan, but what I've noticed lately that there just seems to be anger on everybody's part about all this. And I mean, a classic example is that there was a huge percentage of people that voted for Barack Obama twice and then turned around in the following election and voted for Donald Trump. Now that's not, that those aren't a bunch of racists. They're just pissed off, aren't they?
Yep.
Yep. Oh yeah. I mean, they're saying that the system doesn't work,
Right.
So we make it work less. Well, I guess. I don't know.
Well, your piece, Gary, really pointed out the value of public investment. If that can be one part of a better, clearer understanding of the value of investing in people, then that might help us begin to move forward in a much more positive way. And even Michael Kitch's cynicism and I mean, Michael agrees with you, so right?
Yeah, I look, I just see the obstacles. I mean, one of the things that's happened, I think, apart from the economic issues, which are still, despite the kind of slow return to some sort of equilibrium, is still a problem. The other problem has been, and I don't know how to put my finger on it, but a lot of the political thinking, particularly on the right, is about individuals. It's about my freedom. It's about, and to some extent, I think the left also plays into this in a way. And what's missing is what's good for the community. What the divisions are so sharp and irreconcilable in so many cases, because people's values have changed, and the emphasis on the part of particularly the culture warriors that have, it's about my freedom, and I just want to be left alone to do what I want to do, because it doesn't, on the mistaken assumption is that it doesn't affect anybody else. And in fact, it does. And that's what we saw, I think, particularly with the rise of the Liberty Group in the House in the last couple of years. That I have a right to carry a gun, and if it intimidates other people or makes them uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine.
How do you, I think if you asked even those people about the value of community, they would in essence agree that there should be a great deal of value placed on a sense of community and the results of community. So how do you move in that direction so that becomes a unifying force for us?
Well, I think the problem right now, Wayne, is they have a sense of community is different than perhaps you and me and Michael might have. I mean, their sense of community. I mean, I remember one of those free staters standing up on the floor of the House saying, you know, I don't want to live with you and you don't want to live with me. So why don't you go to a blue state and I'll stay here? Well, I mean, that's the attitude. That's what their sense of community is at this point. I think they've, you know, somehow this whole idea of a social contract has just been lost, that you give up a little bit of your freedom so that everybody has safety and everybody has protection. And it seems to be that it's hard. It's just so polarized that it's very hard to get to the middle anymore. And it's very hard to find any kind of common ground.
Yeah, it's a pretty lonely place.
And you look at, they were so proud of the fact that they had a quote unquote miracle budget where they all came together. I mean, and you know, not that long ago when you were in there, that happened all the time, Wayne. I mean, it wasn't something that was just, wow, it's a miracle. I mean, that was the way it was done. And now we can't seem to do that.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that Americans kind of forget, because they don't really pay much attention to history except to celebrate certain events, is to understand that this is a very young country. Two, we had an enormous advantage because we started with a very, very wealthy continent, large continent, rich in natural resources, etc. And a relatively small population that grew and grew very rapidly. But nevertheless, for most of our history, we've enjoyed abundance. And now things are not as abundant as they once were. Whether it's resources that have been depleted, or whether it's resources that have become more expensive, or whether it's resources that we can't use because of the climate situation. And when things become scarce, it becomes more difficult to share them. And that's what we have failed to do, is share them in an equitable way. If you look at European countries, they're small. They don't have abundant natural resources. They live close together. Over the centuries, they have developed ways of living with scarcity, war, reconstruction, etc., and pulling together. And we've never had that experience. We've gone from abundance to relative scarcity in the last, say, what, since the 1960s, 70s, and we're having a hard time sharing it. The housing crisis is a perfect example. Not in my neighborhood. We need affordable housing, but not in Hebron or Alexandria or Moultonborough or Guilford or Alton. You know, that's the attitude. And I don't know how you get over that.
Do you think that there's opportunity in the crises that we're staring down, beginning with AI and the climate crisis, to begin to figure that out, Michael?
I don't know. I don't know anything about AI except how to spell it. And I don't want to come across as a total alarmist on the climate crisis, but I don't think it's something we can ignore. And I think it's going to require sharing and if you like, trade. I don't want to say sacrifices, but some pretty difficult trade-offs. And I just don't think we're in a mood to think that way. I mean, this is still the baby boom generation. I mean, the wealthiest, most prosperous generation in American history. It'll be a while before we get to the point where people say, gee, maybe we ought to learn to do things together a little bit better. I don't know.
Gary, do you see any signs of hope on the horizon in your experience?
I mean, I am not terribly optimistic, but I got to tell you, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago. It's not a meeting, it was a kind of a lecture or conversation with the person who's the head of the World Wildlife Federation. He happens to have a summer home here in London. He was talking about, he was asked a question. I mean, are you optimistic about what's happening in terms of the climate? Are you optimistic that we can actually do something to make a difference? And he said he is, because there's all this wonderful opportunity out there. And he said it's everywhere. And he praised the Biden administration for making billions of dollars available like nowhere else in the world for people who have ideas to go out there and try to make change. And he said, I'm always optimistic as long as there's opportunity there. And he said, there's tremendous opportunity in the climate change area. So I think in that respect, we might have some hope, but I'm not really, I think we're kind of getting into the teetering point where it's almost a little too late.
Well, I'm gonna take the good news so that I don't end this on a low note. Thank Michael Kitch, Gary Rayno. Thank you very much for speaking with me today, and I appreciate your time, and I always love talking with you both.
Anytime.
All right, it was great talking to you, Wayne.
Take care.
Take care now.